I'm Margaret Frondorf. I'm the Director of SAIS Alumni Relations, and I'm here on a beautiful day in June, and I am interviewing Ambassador Sam Lewis, who is with the class of 1954, and I want to ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
And you just respond as you wish. First of all, I wanted to ask you what brought you to SAIS. How did you learn about it, and what was the interest in going to a school?
I had already decided by the time I went to graduate school that I was going to enter the Foreign Service. I'd taken the exam at Yale and passed, and I was waiting to get an appointment. And they had frozen all appointments in that period because Joe McCarthy was riding roughshod over the U.S. government, and they were reinvestigating the loyalty of everybody who was in the State Department before hiring anybody else. So I looked around to do something about graduate school while waiting, and I had to make a decision between international relations and history, my two majors at Yale, and law school, which most of my classmates were going to law school or Wall Street. And I decided I wanted to go for a short MA program because I didn't want to be stuck for 3 years either in law school or a long PhD program, which I had no interest in anyway. I knew I wanted to be a practitioner, not an academic. And I applied to the usual suspects: Georgetown and SAIS and Fletcher and maybe one or two other, Columbia. And SAIS gave me a very nice fellowship. And the idea of being in Washington was particularly attractive because I wanted to get accustomed to the pace of this city and meet some of the players. And I think those two things, the size of the fellowship and being where it was, and the small school also, where I didn't feel lost at Yale, but it's not a huge university, but it's different size to say the least. And so that's how I got to SAIS.
Some early memories of SAIS. You got there and...
1953, fall of 52.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got there and I was surprised to discover that it was in a house in the first place. There on Florida Avenue, the old apartment house that was converted. And I was surprised by the size of the faculty and the size of the students' body and general atmosphere of informality and the prestige of some of the people they were gathering around the government to give lectures as adjuncts. The atmosphere of intimacy and fraternization between the faculty and the students, nice, informal, family-like kind of setting almost, was a change from Yale, though not total change. And that was my biggest impression, along with the fact that I love being in Washington.
What about a memorable course or professor?
I decided to major for some odd reason in Middle East studies, never having been to the Middle East, but I'd gotten intrigued with the Middle East. So I signed up for a course of Majid Kaduri's, who was the grand old man of Middle East history. An Iraqi Jew, actually, which I learned later on. And a good historian, very dull, the dullest lecturer I've ever been around in my life, and a man who believed above all in the facts. The dates of the treaties. We all had to learn the date of the Treaty of Kuchu-Kamarja, a fairly low-level interest to anybody who doesn't specialize in Ottoman history, I think. And we all went to sleep in his class periodically, but he didn't seem to mind very much as long as you memorized the dates. I really only later discovered that he really was, in fact, a great authority on Iraqi and Ottoman history, and regarded so. But at the time, I thought he was a terrible teacher. And you had to go through his course if you wanted to be a Middle East expert. And you had to take Arabic or Persian or French. Now, never having been in the Middle East and never having really met many people from the Middle East, this was all very theoretical, and I wasn't sure I wanted to invest my life in being an Arabic scholar, or Persian scholar for that matter. So I took French as my language. And I've always been glad about that, because if I had indeed gone on to Arabic, as most of the other Middle East specialists did, and if I then had gone in the Foreign Service the same way, I would have been stuck in rotating from one Arab capital to another, probably the rest of my career. As it was, I ended up as a generalist and only got to the Middle East a long time later.
So just moving into the scene in Washington in the early 50s, you mentioned the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
Where memories of something that may have happened during the 2 years that you were at SAIS in the city that made an impression on you and your career.
I was raised in Texas, in Houston, lived and went through high school in Texas before I went to Yale on a scholarship. And I was accustomed to living in a segregated city, therefore. And don't forget, this is all before segregation ended, really, legally. And so the fact that the National Theater closed because they didn't want to obey the rules on a traveling company that was coming through there, which would not perform unless the audience were unsegregated. So they didn't come, and the theater then closed for quite a while. The trolley cars were something else, and the whole atmosphere of the nation's capital, very well governed as a city by the commissioners, but of course without any local participation much in that. The museums were great, the monuments were wonderful, we loved wandering around, and there were lots of informal things to do that were cheap. But there was this overhang of segregation in the city and the two worlds, which wasn't unfamiliar to me, but I hadn't enjoyed in Houston, and I enjoyed it even less in Washington. So the beginnings of the movement toward desegregation was an interesting trend that hadn't gone very far, because this was before Brown versus Board of Education. But Harry Truman had desegregated the military during World War II, theoretically at least, and things were moving. I loved getting around the city on the trolleys. I think the trolleys were the greatest loss Washington ever underwent, and I see they're beginning to come back, at least in the northeast section, because it was easy to move around the city inexpensively, and we didn't have much money. And there was a general slowness of pace, which isn't true today, but it was still a southern city, very much a southern city. And people talked slower and walked slower and didn't have that air of intense stress and eagerness to get somewhere and do something that characterizes the city today.
Talk a little bit about your distinguished career at the State Department, and then maybe kind of the impact that had SAIS on that over time, or?
Well, I was really lucky in the assignments I got, as it turned out. And in those days, you had very little to do with your assignments. You put in once a year your April Fool's request for your next post, which was promptly filed and ignored usually. And I came in at a time when they were just starting to hire. And I had passed with a high grade, so I was in the very first group that was appointed after the freeze was lifted. Meanwhile, I'd gotten married, brought my wife up from Houston. We met in church when we were 15 years old, and we'd been dating off and on. She went to college in Texas, and I went to college here, or in New Haven. But we started our married life here in a little apartment over 3 blocks from SAIS for about a year while I was waiting and took some extra courses at SAIS. And George Kennan came down and gave a summer course at SAIS, the summer that we were here between 53 and 54, I guess. And that was a real highlight, as were hearing some of the people from the State Department and from the CIA who lectured and gave adjunct courses. So I really was getting a good feel for the government from people I encountered at SAIS, and that encouraged me a lot about the Foreign Service, although I was already headed in that direction. And then all of a sudden we got a call, they're going to appoint a lot of new vice consuls because they've got a big piece of legislation was rammed through Congress by the Italian lobby, which was then the most powerful lobby in Washington. Even more powerful than AIPAC is today, I would say. And they'd gotten through a bill to put, I think, 150,000 additional immigrant visas for refugees who hadn't yet been properly resettled from previous conflicts. Turned out that most of those, of course, were Italian. And they actually, as I discovered in Italy, they actually were refugees usually from earthquakes that occurred back in the 1920s, but somehow they'd never been totally resettled, so they were technically eligible. And they hired a whole bunch of us to go out immediately without any training. We had 1 week of orientation, no introductory course, shipped us off to Naples, which was one of the posts that was designated to issue these visas. Sally and I checked into the hotel in Naples. Neither of us had ever been abroad, much less to Italy. And we found dank weather. It was very cold and rainy that time in Naples, May of 1954. But we got on our best clothes and she put on her hat and we went down to the consulate to check in. And we walked into the, all excited, first post, first time abroad. We walked into the administrative officer's office at the consulate general. He took one look at us and he said, "Oh my God, not another one!" Turned out within a month there were 22 new vice consuls arriving in Naples for this new program. But it was a great post, as it turned out. We were all a kind of an assembly line for visas. But we learned Italian. We had a good Italian course there, and we explored that lovely part of Italy. We got an apartment after a while right down on the water, on the bay, with the Bay of Naples, 12 feet below our balcony. Could enter right from some steps carved out of the side of the hillside there, in that peninsula that runs out, Mergellina, that runs out from Naples proper. And we looked out of our living room and bedroom right directly at Capri and Vesuvius across a patio, a lovely terrace really, of 20 by 30 or something like that. So it was pretty romantic actually. The only problem was to get to that apartment you had to go down a flight of 142 steps from the road up on the cliffside above to this old palazzo, 15th century palazzo, from which the apartments were carved. And that, and those steps went through a tunnel, and they were carved out of the tufa stone, and they doubled as urinals for anybody who walked by, and it was really quite an interesting to get to our place. Once you were there, it was glorious.
And you had a couple of other posts as well.
Yeah, we moved from there to Florence, and we had 3.5 years in Florence, which wasn't too rough either. Lovely time. And it was a small post, so I got to do everything in Florence. And I did the political work, and there was a lot of it actually in that area because that was the big red belt, communist part of Italy at the time. And I was the American diplomatic representative to the Kingdom, the Republic of San Marino, one of the smallest republics in the world. They have they had a deal with Italy. Italy sort of took care of the foreign relations, but they wouldn't allow any ambassador for San Marino to come from Rome. He had to come from another place. So our consuls in Florence were the diplomatic representatives. And we'd go over to San Marino twice a year for these ceremonies when they installed the captain's regent. 2 leaders elected under the old Venetian rules with the Venetian costumes, and that was very exciting, particularly since San Marino was communist. It was governed by a communist socialist coalition. And we were quietly talking with the Christian Democrats in late night meetings in Florence and bars and so on, how they were going to get power and overthrow the communist government in San Marino. Great fun. Then later on we served in Brazil, and we served in Afghanistan, we served ultimately in Israel for 8 years. and they were all so different. And all really, I was lucky. I had interesting jobs everywhere. I went with AID in Brazil for 2 years, and then I moved into the ambassador's office as his executive assistant, really, for a while. But I enjoyed the aid work down there, and I got to know a lot about the Peace Corps and AID. And then we went later on to Afghanistan, where I was number 2 at the time of the coup, and the king was overthrown, and that was pretty exciting. And those were the glory days in Afghanistan, when it really was a wonderful post, and remote, interesting, friendly, quite primitive, but proud also. Poor, but not starving. And beginning to be a democratic system with the king who was encouraging democracy and women taking off the shadri. But of course the Civil War later washed all that away, and then now we again have Afghanistan kind of back at square one. And all our investment in those years was washed away by the revolution and the Civil War. Later on, I had several really interesting jobs in Washington, which pure luck in many respects. I was Italian desk officer for a while after all those years in Italy. And then one day in the beginning of the Johnson administration, Kennedy administration, lots of presidents, Jack Kennedy was elected. His foreign affairs advisor was Chester Bowles, a very leading liberal congressman at that time, former ambassador to India, had been a big advertising executive in most of his career, leader of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party at that time. Chet thought he was going to be Secretary of State. Turned out he was number 2, deputy. He was undersecretary, which is the deputy secretary job today. And he came up from Capitol Hill with 2 aides, Tom Hughes and Jim Thompson, who worked for him there. And the State Department didn't know what to do with him. He was a great speaker, writer, very expansive man, brilliant thinker, traveled a whole lot around the world, a real idealist. Didn't quite fit the State Department model. And they wanted to have somebody in his office who would get him used to how things really happened and make his office function like the rest of the building. Somehow I got selected to be his special assistant for that reason. And that was the biggest luck break of my life, because that's the first time I really encountered the 7th floor of the State Department. And through working for Chet, traveled with him to 80 countries around the world. He was representing the president in all sorts of special missions. And I saw an awful lot of posts where I wouldn't like to be assigned, so that was useful too. But I got a breadth in my approach toward the world that I never had before. I was really a Europeanist up to that point, studied and lived there. But now I was traveling in Africa, Asia, Latin America, which were the 3 main foci of his interests and his missions, and got to meet a lot of fascinating world figures. And after 2.5 years of that, Johnson took office, and he asked Chet to go back to India for a second time as ambassador. Chet tried to persuade me to go with him. He and his wife Steb were really wonderful to younger officers, and we spent a lot of time with them socially as well as work-wise. And I was introduced through that association to a lot of the big players in Washington, around the swimming pool at Chet's house in Georgetown on weekends and so forth. The Stuart Alsops and Joe Alsops of this world. But I didn't feel I wanted to go back to, I'd like to have gone to India, but I didn't feel I ought to be his assistant any longer. You're around somebody of that powerful intellect and personality, and you're writing letters for him, and you're writing memos for him, and you are writing speeches for him, helping him. You kind of lose track of who you are, because if you do it well, you've got to be able to work in the mode of the person you're working for. And I kind of was losing track of myself, so I thought I'd better get free of Chet's aura and magnetism. Instead, I wanted to work with AID for a while and get some experience with aid, because Chet was always making speeches about aid. And we were dealing a lot of aid issues from Washington. So I got selected just at that moment for some reason to go to Princeton for a year as a mid-career fellow. I didn't feel like I was in mid-career, but anyway, I was selected for state's representative that year to a Princeton program that had other government agencies there as well. And from there, I talked with the guy who was I already knew the director of Latin American aid from working with Chet. I told him I'd be interested in a tour with them. So I went on a detail assignment with AID to Rio. And that was a fascinating couple of years. And then I went into the ambassador's office. Later on, after Afghanistan, I was called back to be the deputy director of the policy planning staff by Win Lord, and Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. So I had a lot of dealings with Henry directly and for him and writing for him and trying to dodge his verbal bullets. Terrible man to work for, but everybody who worked for him took the beatings and the tongue lashings and respected him enough so that they were quite loyal. And that policy planning period was one in which I saw how tremendously effective the policy planning staff can be when the secretary wants it to be, because it really reports directly to him. And the director, Win Lord, had been with him in the White House and come over to state and had his trust, so he used us a whole lot. And we weren't doing bureaucratic stuff. We really were working on the big issues for him and helping write his speeches. From there, Kissinger asked me to run the UN Bureau, the international organizations. So I moved down there for a couple of years, and then Carter was elected, and I enjoyed that job. It was quite new. I made a lot of speeches around the country. I spent a lot of time in New York with the Security Council. And I spent a lot of time struggling with whether the PLO was going to be able to speak before the Security Council, which we were trying to block. And I used about 50% of my energy on the PLO problem in New York for a while in that job. So I got the beginnings of familiarity with the diplomatic problems of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli dispute, through that job. Through a series of interesting things I won't bore you with, suddenly I was asked to go out as ambassador and vacate the job when the administration changed. When Carter came in, Andy Young, who was his new UN representative and very close personally to Carter, hated Richard Nixon. So he told Carter he'd take the job, but he wanted everybody out of the mission in New York and the bureau in Washington who ever had any kind of appointment from Richard Nixon. Well, if you're a career officer, you have appointments from all your presidents, and most of the ones I work for were Republicans. So I was, Cy Vance, the new Secretary of State, had good things, heard about me and wanted me to stay there, but he wasn't going to pick a fight with Andy Young over this particular issue. So they looked around for an embassy to ask me to take. And they suggested 3 possibilities: India, South Africa, and Israel. I never thought of Israel. Been there once. Visited my friend Nick Veliotis there when he was DCM once, coming back from Kabul. Stopped off for 2 days. And that was my exposure to the physical side of Israel, but I did know a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian problem from the New York side. Well, growing up in a segregated city we'd gotten out of, and knowing that South Africa was still in the throes of apartheid, neither of us felt we could handle some of the internal conflicts of serving in South Africa at that time. We were supporting the apartheid government then. So I declined to be considered for that. India would have been very challenging, very big, too big, I thought, really. And a huge aid program. I'd been to India with Chet. I knew a lot about it from working with him. I've been there several times. I just didn't think I could handle the size of that mission without ever having been there before. And Israel was intriguing. It was something I never thought of, but obviously an interesting post, so we went to Israel. And we were there for 8 years.
Wow.
Carter I was with Carter at Camp David in all the peace treaty negotiations, and that was really exciting when we achieved the peace with Egypt. Then I was there while we had the war with Lebanon to try to get the Israelis out of Lebanon. First get the PLO out of Lebanon, then get the Israelis out of Lebanon. And that was a painful but very challenging time, working with Phil Habib and the President and Secretary Vance and Haig and then Schultz. But 8 years was 8 years. Reagan asked me to stay on so I was there first term of Reagan as well. All of Carter, first term of Reagan. And then I retired because I was really worn down to a nub, and they'd offered me some other jobs in Washington, but none of them could bear comparison, really, with the challenge of Israel in that time.
You were there at an extraordinary time, and there were extraordinary accomplishments.
It's all about timing and who you work for and what your challenges are. And in all of these jobs, I have to say the kind of education I had at SAIS, it wasn't the greatest place in the world academically in those days. I think it is now. But the academic side was good. It didn't compare really with Yale. But the atmospherics of it, the camaraderie with people with similar career ambitions, and the continual flow of people from this city who were really in the game and could give us a sense of what the game was going to be like, made SAIS a very special place. It was exactly the right place to go for me at that time. And we were only 70 students, of which I think 7 were women, by the way, only. But they kept us busy.
Well, with that, Ambassador Lewis, thank you so much. Thank you for the memory, sharing both about SAIS and your amazing career, and we'll conclude our interview.
Okay.